As a stunning 8 in 10 U.S. voters say the economy is their top concern, the government reports a decline in consumer spending last month. For the month of September 2024, retail sales were slightly less than they had been in September 2023. Just a week ago, the National Retail Federation had said that retail spending had actually declined in the month of September, though they found that it was slightly higher than last year. In other words, the Federation's results were pretty close to the Census Bureau's from this morning, close enough that alarm bells should be ringing out everywhere, at least outside of voter concerns, but they're not. That's because the government's seasonally adjusted September estimate for retail sales was somehow higher than everything, even beating analysts' expectations if exclusively on the basis of that seasonal adjustment. It's the payroll mess all over again, except here when it comes to spending, there's even more corroboration for the weakness in retail sales. You can find it everywhere. The National Retail Federation itself, they claim it's their highest quality data, though their chief economist's statement is something else. It's really something to behold, and I'll get to that a little bit later here. But also today, the Federal Reserve reported a sharp drop in industrial production, including manufacturing, and as usual, revised down previous months, in particular August, which no longer looks nearly as good as it had when it was first released. This is why, first of all, Americans rate the economy so poorly, yet the establishment, for lack of a better term, can't figure out why that is. It also demonstrates why there's so little faith in the mainstream media, which will only report on the one result rather than the full context. And by full context, I don't just mean industrial production or the National Retail Federation, though it is the National Retail Federation. What I really mean is that retail sales, both seasonally adjusted and unadjusted, actually do largely agree. They are far apart on September, sure, but overall, they both come down in the same exact danger zone. That's the part they never tell you. And remember, we're only talking about nominal retail sales. In real terms, adjusting for prices, it's even worse. And what we keep seeing is that consumer spending, even in nominal retail sales, pretend to be shocked, cooled off substantially during the summertime. And it's one of the top concerns for voters because knowing that they've lost so much purchasing power, they can sense what's coming in the labor market, and it is already having an impact on their spending habits and therefore reinforcing that weakness across the general economy. One recent poll said, as the 2024 presidential election draws closer, about 8 in 10 registered voters say that the economy is one of their top issues when thinking about their vote in the November election. Voters continue to remain pessimistic about the state of the national economy, with 66% saying it is very or somewhat poor. However, almost 6 in 10 say their own financial situation is good. So you can understand what they're actually saying here when you actually listen to what's going on, when you don't just dismiss these concerns as a bunch of crybaby whiners talking about a vibe session that they don't see in the mainstream data. It is all across the mainstream data when you actually look for it and put it in context. But what voters are saying is that they can see that it's not good out there, even if it hasn't yet directly impacted them. So they rate their own personal situation as relatively decent, not necessarily the worst case, but they're afraid because they can see weakness around the entire economy. They are very afraid that they're going to fall into that category. And so they're rating the economy poor, and they're saying the concern about the economy is at the top of their list, and really it was 79% said that in the poll, and another 19% said it was important, just not the most. So in other words, 98% of the people that they polled are talking about the economy because they're deathly afraid of falling out from where they are into where nobody wants to be, especially with a hiring freeze. The economy is poor, and that's what we keep coming back to over and over again. And that's the same verdict that we get from both forms of retail sales. Seasonally adjusted might have been big in September because of that seasonal adjustment, but the wider context showed that danger zone is all over the numbers. What the Census Bureau actually reported earlier today was that nominal retail sales in the month of September 2024 rose 0.43% month over month, which is well above expectations. It was a rebound from basically being flat in August. But when you look at the year over year change, that was just 1.86%, which that's not good. As I talked about in a previous video, and I'll continue to point out here, anything less than 3% in nominal retail sales is consistent with recession. So while the monthly number looked good on seasonal adjustments, the annual change, 1.86%, not so good. That's an alarm bell there. And it's the same with the not seasonally adjusted figures. Because we can't make a month-to-month comparison, we don't have a monthly change that looks like an apples to apples. The not seasonally adjusted number was down fractionally year over year. So comparing this September to last September, unadjusted nominal retail sales were slightly lower. That's well within the danger zone. Of course, if it's nominally negative, it's well under 3%. And that's actually the second decline over the last 4 months. So when you look at the year-over-year change in nominal retail sales and you give it a 6-month average, it's down at 2.27%, which is actually fairly close to the 6-month average year-over-year change for the seasonally adjusted series, which is at 2.46%. Both of them firmly below 3% and in the danger zone. And it's this kind of discussion and context, that's why Eurodollar University exists. And that's why we have the daily briefing, the deep dive analysis, and our Eurodollar University memberships. We are winding down our fall sales, which have incredible discounts on everything. So if you want to know how the monetary system works and how it affects the economy, what's really going on in the economy and how to tell, our subscriptions have got you covered. And I also want to mention that we are doing another live Q&A here on YouTube next Tuesday, the October 22nd at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So check that out if you're able to. The details about the live stream, as well as the savings, the fall sale, the subscriptions, all of that can be found at our website, eurodollar.university. So getting back to the nonsense, and it really is nonsense, the National Retail Federation, as I mentioned in the introduction, they reported last week that their view of retail sales in September were alarmingly bad. Contraction in the month and only a slight positive year over year. So very much similar to what we're seeing in the unadjusted series from the Census Bureau. So despite the fact that the National Retail Federation reported its own data that was pretty grim, their chief economist, after hearing the Census Bureau's estimates that were released today, well, he had this to say. Well, there have been some signs of tightening consumer spending. Yeah, your own data. September's numbers show consumers are willing to spend where they see value. September sales come amid the recent trend of payroll gains and other positive economic signs. Just not positive economic signs from their own data. And what they claimed about what they showed about their data, which they reported last week, was CNBC NRF Retail Monitor, which is powered by Affinity Solutions, reported that core retail sales were down. I love how they throw this in, a slight 0.28% seasonally adjusted month over month in September. That's 0.28% decline is pretty substantial. But they were up almost a full percent year over year, which is, again, not a good number. Anything less than 3% is not good. That compared with increases of 0.17% month over month and 1.93% year over year in August. Now, here's what they say about their own data, though. Unlike survey-based numbers collected by the Census Bureau, this retail monitor uses actual anonymized credit and debit card purchase data compiled by Affinity Solutions that gives more accurate results in real time that do not need to be revised monthly or annually. In other words, they're saying their own statistics are far superior to what you get from the Census Bureau, yet the National Retail Federation's chief economist is coming out there running around saying, look at the Census Bureau's numbers, and ignoring their own. I guess I said, it's no wonder why people's faith in the media, as well as these establishment types, is fallen off so far. They refuse to report the actual evidence and the context, instead trying to give it a spin because it's much more fun and much more economical for their purposes. As I said, 3% is the consistent recession danger zone. 3% in nominal terms. You get to 3% on a consistent basis, which means more than a single month, like using a 6-month average, for example, that just confirms that spending has fallen off too far and too much. And I mentioned in that previous video that really it's real retail sales that you should be worried about, but just sticking with nominal here, what you see is that nominal retail sales, both seasonally adjusted and unadjusted, which are largely together, despite the month-to-month changes and some variations in the seasonal adjustments, by and large, when you use the 6-month average, they're pretty close to each other. So as we see a below 3% 6-month average for unadjusted sales, we see the same thing in seasonally adjusted. Forget September's number. We are well within the danger zone, and you could see how it has slowed down during The summertime. Summertime is the time for recession. It certainly is for retail sales. Just going back quickly through the history, the last time we got retail sales, both unadjusted and seasonally adjusted, the year-over-year changes on a 6-month average below 3%, that was the middle of 2019 when we were talking about recession back then. Now, we don't know how that would have turned out. I believe it would have turned into a recession. But either way, the middle of 2019, you got inversions in the yield curve, all the recession warnings, you got the Fed cutting rates consistent with economic weakness, not strength. You see it also in the middle of 2015 and 2016. Again, middle of the year, summertime. 2015 into 2016, very close to the recession in the United States. It was basically a mini recession in a lot of respects. So retail sales that fell below the 3% mark in nominal terms, consistent with all that. You didn't get below 3% nominal retail sales growth until the middle of 2008, really after the first stage of the Great Not Recession had already happened. And going back further, in the dot-com recession in 2001, the entire dot-com recession was right around 2 to 3% nominal changes in retail sales. Never negative, just 2 to 3%, which is enough weakness that it triggers all the bad stuff that happens with recession, the vicious cycle. Lack of spending, lack of revenue growth. Businesses have to respond by trimming their costs, cutting back hours, sometimes cutting back employees, everything that we associate with recession. And it comes around with retail sales that are this low. As I mentioned, real retail sales, those are still negative on a year-over-year basis, and they are now falling way behind even the 2010s trend, which means that Americans are now buying less and getting less than they would have had there never been a pandemic. They're getting less and it's getting worse. We keep falling further and further behind, which just exacerbates all of these imbalances all over the economy, especially inventory. That weakness, the actual consistent weakness in both the adjusted and unadjusted retail sales series, along with the National Retail Federation's data, that weakness is echoed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve statistics on industrial production were down pretty big in the month of September. What the Fed showed was that IP was down pretty big in September. There were major downward revisions to previous months. It goes all the way back to April. April, which had been relatively flat, that's now a negative. May, which had been a large rebound, that's been revised lower. I've talked about and pointed out June, which was a huge increase, at least at the initial estimate. Now it's almost zero. There was a big decline in July after that June increase, which was revised to now less of one. So that's one that was an upward revision. In August was supposed to be a huge rebound from July. Now the Federal Reserve is saying it's less than half of what was originally estimated, though some of that was due to the upward revision in July. But either way, the August increase is now well below what everybody thought when they looked at August and said, look at how great the industry is performing. And now on top of all of that, we've got September coming in at a decline. As far as U.S. industry is concerned, especially manufacturing, nothing has changed here. If anything, it continues to get worse. Because in the world that we live in, flat to slightly lower is, over a lot of time, a huge, enormous contraction. And the more time it goes without any substantial uptick and change, any meaningful recovery, the worse that contraction gets. There is a consistent picture through all of this economic data, whether it be consumer spending, production, and forward-looking indicators like the surveys that we often point to. For example, if we line up real retail sales, so that's price-adjusted retail sales, here excluding motor vehicles, what you see is that it matches perfectly with the Federal Reserve's data on industrial production. Here we'll show manufacturing. So as consumers buy less goods, less volume of goods go to consumers, obviously U.S. factories and foreign factories too are going to be manufacturing less stuff, which is exactly what they're doing. And that lines up pretty well with any number of these soft surveys, sentiment surveys that we have, whether it be the ISM, S&P Global, or even the Fed regional surveys. They all line up perfectly with one another, showing that demand continues to be absent, and the further that we go along in the same state, the bigger the contraction becomes. And the bigger the contraction becomes, the more it impacts the labor market, it impacts consumer psychology, and it leads to that growing vicious cycle. And as far as industrial production goes as a recession signal, In its very long history that goes back to 1919, whenever it has declined on a year-over-year basis, it has meant recession. And every time except for the one, that was in 2015, actually late 2015 into 2016. But outside of that, every time you see a year-over-year negative in industrial production, there's a recession that follows. And again, as I said before, 2015 and 16 was very close to being one too. Industrial production turned lower year over year in the middle of last year, which is right around the time that we saw all of this stuff really start to really become a bigger issue. We saw the inflection in the economy. For example, industrial production turned negative in June of 2023, right when the unemployment rate started to rise. So there's another correlation that fits. And one final point that we should mention here, while we're talking about the goods economy, the more the goods economy remains under pressure, the more that is going to pressure services as well. So more weakness in consumer spending on retail sales for goods, more weakness in production of goods because there is no demand for them, the more that's going to hinder and hamper and eventually negatively impact the services economy too. And we're already seeing that as well. We see that in a number of different ways. Like, for example, payroll report on professional and business services. That's been almost exactly identical and consistent to what we're seeing here in the goods economy. So September was not a good month in the economy in any respect, except for in retail sales, that one factor, the seasonal adjustment. But even this, setting that aside, September retail sales on an adjusted and unadjusted basis, when you look at the year-over-year change, they actually do agree that the consumer spending part of the economy slowed down substantially during the summertime. I know, pretend to be shocked here. But it wasn't just retail sales, because there's a consistent link between consumer spending and industrial production. When you get past all of the revisions, industrial production is going nowhere to slightly lower in absolute terms too, which is an enlarging and growing contraction there as well, corroborating the weakness in the economy, especially when you get the year-over-year negatives, which are a recession signal. So we've got industrial production, you've got retail sales, it fits with hiring, and it fits with the fact that every single voter that comes into contact with these political surveys says our number one concern is the economy. Even though I don't think right now I'm all that bad off, I'm certainly not doing great, I'm very concerned about the economy, because as it continues to get weak, and as I see the signs of weakness everywhere else that everyone else ignores, I'm worried that I can become one of those on the wrong side of this divide, because that divide is actually growing. And all the data that we continue to get from September and the summer shows the divide is growing, because recession isn't just a risk. It was the same with the payroll report. The September number looked really good, but the rest of the data, the rest of the context, not so much. So I talked about that with Steve in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Check out our live Q&A next week, our fall sale winding down. Thanks to all Eurodollar University members and subscribers. Until next time, take care.